several years ago, pre-COVID actually, Yvonne and I went to, it was at Christmas time, we went to Love Park in Philadelphia. If you've ever been down there, it's kind of a neat place, especially at Christmas. You know, there's lots of stalls, there's food, there's ice skating, you know, there's lights, there's music. It's really quite an enjoyable thing to kind of walk around this whole area. And we were going through it, and we came across a corner where they were doing street evangelism. They had signs, they had sandwich boards, they had bullhorns, and they were not shy. And we stopped, because I still remember, you want to remember, we stopped and we watched these people. And as people walked past, they yelled about sin. They yelled about hell, how people were going there without Jesus. They talked about how the Catholic Church was just filled with pedophiles. And on and on and on it went. It's like they had a loaded gun and they were firing every bullet they had. The tone was angry. It was harsh. Most people, to their credit, in this crowded place, just ignored them, just walked around and walked past them. But it honestly made me a little sick to my stomach. Because I thought, is this now what people think when they think of a follower of Jesus? And more to our discussion that we've been doing, is this what it feels like when we picture having a spiritual conversation with somebody? We're like, oh, I can be friendly and I can talk to people, but oh my goodness, spiritual conversation, that feels like I have to take out the bullhorn and go at people who really want nothing to do with what I have to say. Or am I the only person that's ever felt that? Well, we're going to talk about this. We're in this whole series on evangelism, how to connect with people who don't know Jesus. We're in week 4. And we have been challenging everybody in our church that says this year we want to go one step further. We want to build these connections with people who don't know Jesus. And the reason we do this is because we desire to introduce people to Jesus. There's tons of people who need Jesus. They don't know him. And so the only way that happens is in relationship, right? That's how people generally hear about Jesus, is in relationship. And we build relationships through conversations. And so, we're in the middle of this series on the 6 gears of conversation. And for those of you that maybe haven't been here for all of it, we're basically going through it like this. We're looking at this there's a kind of a building of conversations when we're dealing with people. There's casual conversations that we've already talked about. Mike did a great job of unpacking last week this idea of what a meaningful conversation looks like. Today we're going to look at spiritual conversations, different from salvation conversations. And then we're going to look at the last 2 as well. So let's do a quick summary before we jump in, because we want to make sure we're all on the same page. So far, here's the principles we've come up with. One is that evangelism begins. This desire to see people come to know Jesus begins between you and God. In other words, that the desire to actually do this, to engage with people, to even want to be around or to let people know about Jesus, that starts between us and God. When we're talking to him and asking us, God, to give us the same heart that he has. That was what we learned in the first week. Then he said, well, casual conversations then are the doorways to these potentially deeper relationships that we have with others, right? So the casual conversations are not just casual conversations. They're sometimes opportunities, they're doorways, they're things we can walk through to more. And then, last week, we looked at this idea that meaningful conversations begin to form those deeper relationships. Meaningful conversations, right? Where we tap into something that's important to them, and we begin to have these conversations, which begins to cause meaningful interaction and relationship. Now, how does all that translate to spiritual conversation? Well, in this entire series, we've been using this roadmap that comes out of something that Paul wrote to the church in Colossae. And we call our book of Colossians. And if you remember, we're going to read this again every week. At the end, he says, devote yourselves to prayer, right? That's where this all begins. Being watchful, being thankful. And pray for us, too, that God may open a door for our message so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. He's in jail. Pray that I might proclaim it clearly as I should. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Make the most of every opportunity. He encourages others just like himself to look for those places to have those deeper spiritual conversations. The word that Paul uses here actually literally means to redeem the time, to keep something from being lost. So in other words, he's saying, look, the implication is here, look, there are opportunities here in your life. You're having these casual, meaningful conversations. There are opportunities for spiritual conversations. Don't miss them. Don't miss them. Because they matter. So, before we jump into anything, I asked myself the question, so what is a spiritual conversation? Good question. It's exactly right. It is a good question because most of us have all these different perspectives and different histories. And some of us feel like a spiritual conversation is like the guy in the corner with the bullhorn unloading the whole message of salvation. Some people feel like, oh my goodness, it's just so pushy, we're not supposed to talk about it. So what do we mean when we say spiritual conversation? And let me give you this definition. I think it captures it. Spiritual conversations happen when we connect God's story to their story and our story. That's a spiritual conversation. It's when we connect the story of God. It's nothing more than making this connection between God's story, the story they're living out, and the story we live in. Now, we have to unpack that a little bit so we can take a look at it. So we're going to go back to the same story that Mike used last week, because Jesus, of course, was a master at this. And so we're going to look at John chapter 4. It's when Jesus meets a woman in Samaria. And what I want to do is I'm just going to read through the story. And what I want you to do as I read is I want you to think and pay attention for, where is God's story in this? Where is her story in this? And where is Jesus' story in this? Okay? So let me go through this story. Because, of course, Jesus is tired. It's the hottest part of the day. He sits down at this well. He sends the disciples ahead to get food. And a Samaritan woman came to draw water. When she did, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews don't associate with Samaritans. And Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him. He would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with. The well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." So the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so I won't get thirsty, I don't have to keep coming back here to draw water." So he told her, "Go call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands. The man you have now is not your husband. What you have said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that this place where you must worship is in Jerusalem." "And woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. And when he comes, he will explain everything to us." And then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." Spiritual conversations happen when we connect God's story to the other person's story, and in the process use our own story. So, how did Jesus model this? It's fascinating because Jesus does all 3 in here. Jesus listened to her story. So he's listening he's having this engagement with her, and he's listening to her story. Now, did you catch all her statements that kind of give you clues in her story? Just take a look at some of them. She says, "You're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" She is used to being ostracized, at least to some degree. Right? There's something in here like, I'm not used to this. Like, this guy's talking to me. What is going on? At least there's something in here that says, she's used to some level of someone pushing her off. She's revealing some history here of segregation. And he says, where can you get this living water? Like, this would be great for me, Jesus, if you give me this living water so I don't have to come back. My life would be better because right now it's pretty complicated. If it wasn't, I wouldn't be here in the middle of the day. Right? And she goes on. Right? I have no husband. You don't know my story. It's complicated. I have difficult family situations. I'm not married. My life's a mess. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, and it goes back to the same prejudice. She is laying out in front her racism and her prejudice. This is what you think, this is what we think. There's a difference here. There's no connections. You vote Republican, I vote Democrat. You're this way, I'm this way. It just doesn't work. I know the Messiah's coming. When he comes, he will explain everything. Do you see her desire for a better future? I want something more. In fact, when the Messiah comes, he's going to fix things. He's going to make sense of all this. I wish I knew what that was. I can hardly wait for it. See, Jesus listened to her statements, and they all reflect some piece of her story. There's some part of what has happened in her life, and he's listening and he's getting her story. Now, if we stop there, we will have what Mike described last week. We'll have a meaningful conversation, right? We will talk about, hey, tell me more. Like, walk me through that. Like, what's happening? And why do you say that? So there's a meaningful conversation. But Jesus wants to go further. And so what he does is he connects her to God's story. Look what he does. He says, if you knew the gift of God and who asked, you would have asked him. He would have given you living water. He's saying, look, God understands the desires of your heart. He gets it. He understands your past. He understands your thirst. He's got an answer for your thirst. He says, true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. Did you know, talking to this woman, that God actually designed us to worship? But not the way you're thinking. He wants you, and he desires you and your worship for him. God is spirit. His worshipers must worship the Spirit. You know what? God's a little different than you've been taught. I mean, you have this whole paradigm that you've seen, but God is actually bigger and broader than what your religious leaders have taught you. So you see what Jesus is doing, right? He's reorienting her. He's saying, I'm hearing your story, but I'm trying to change I'm just trying to reorient you a little more towards God and what he actually thinks of you and who you are. He's not debating it. He's not trying to prove anything. He's not going into apologetics. Not those are bad, but that's not what he's doing here. He's simply saying statements of God and what he's like. And what makes this all so compelling to the woman is the third thing which Jesus does, which he connects God's story and her story to his story. Because look what he says. He says, look, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that's asking you for drink, like if you knew who I was, if you understood that I have the ability to give you something so much better than what you are thinking, you'd be all over this. I'm the source of something that you deeply desire. I, the one speaking to you, I am he. I mean, I'm the one you've been waiting for. You know, this is the very first person Jesus ever told that he was the Messiah. Someone of a different race. A woman in that culture who had no standing, and that's who he told. He's like, I am he. I am the one who will change the trajectory of your life. Spiritual conversations happen when we connect God's story to their story and to ours. Now, that all sounds nice and neat, doesn't it? Kind of packaged up really good. And I know what you're thinking because I think it. I'm not Jesus. Right? I can't do that. And I'm not the source of anybody's solution to anybody's problem. Like, I can't say, well, there's God, there's them. I mean, look, I'm bringing you everything, right? Like, we're not going to do that. It's not going to look quite the same for us, even though the pattern is the same. And a lot of you are thinking, like, I wouldn't even know how to do this. Like, how would I even have this conversation with someone? But the reality is that spiritual conversations can happen anywhere at any time if we're paying attention. So, I want to try and make this very practical this morning. I want to give you a tool that's really helped me in this process over the years in having these kind of conversations. Right? Mike and I talked a lot about that this week. And so let's start with God's story. If I asked you today, what is God's story? what would your answer be? When I was a kid, the answer started and ended with, Jesus came, he died, he rose again, so I get to go to heaven. That's the story. Which is huge. It's important. It's amazing. It's the gospel message. But God's story is so much bigger than that. And if you want to take God's story, this is the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, and break it down. It really breaks down into 4 parts. Creation. What happened at the beginning? God, who always does what's right, he always does what's good, right, and perfect, he decided to create the world, and he created it perfect. It was amazing. It was this compelling place where everybody lived in harmony. He created humanity, humans, Adam and Eve, and they were to steward this amazing creation, and God walked with them. I mean, I don't know if you get that. Like, he walked with them in the cool of the day. They talked face to face. He explained to them, this is what it looks like to live the way that I want you to. He taught them the best possible way. What happened? The fall. Because unfortunately, Adam and Eve, they decided, no, we're going to rebel. We don't want to do it God's way. We want to do it our way. And since they decided they knew better, they rebelled, and in the process were separated from God. And now they're subject to sickness and to pain and to death and to all the problems and conflicts. And they lost his physical daily presence. But God loved us way too much to leave it that way. So what happened? He began the process of redemption. People grew, they were multiplying. God picks this special man named Abraham. He just says, look, I'm picking you because I want to, not because you're anything special, but I'm going to make you special. And his descendants became known as the Israelites. And God said, well, look, I want the Israelites now, this group of people, to show the rest of the world what it's like to live my ways, to do the way I designed it to do. But just like Adam and Eve, the Israelites kind of blew it. And they lived for themselves. They rebelled. They did things their way. They did their culture their way. They did their government their way. They didn't, with some exceptions, didn't follow. And so eventually God said, all right, I'm going to send you the real, fully redemptive solution. Everything's been pointing to this, and so he sent his son to rescue people from sin and the power of sin over their lives. He said, I'm going to give you the power as a result to walk in the ways of Jesus, and you're going to do it in community, in this thing called the church. And you get to do this together. And the last part of the story is restoration. Because the end of the story will come when Jesus comes back. And all evil, and all death, and all pain, and all conflict, and all rebellion will be dealt with. There'll be no sickness, and we will get to live under his rule, and it will be amazing. That's the story of God in 3 minutes. And if you want the scriptures for it, here's how it looks. Genesis 1 and 2, 3, and then the rest of the Bible is under redemption. You ever thought of that? Right? That's how it's set up. It's like God made it this way, it was perfect. We messed it up. So let me tell you how God is going to put it back. And when it's fully back, this is what it's going to look like. That's the story of God. Now, most of you would look at that and go, okay, I can kind of get that. Well, I see that. What does that have to do with anything? Well, here's the cool part. That story arc is the same story arc of every person who's ever lived. Let me show you. That's God's story. What if I look at my story? Okay, what does that mean? Creation is something created who I am. Like, there are things that shaped my understanding of myself. Right? You can ask these questions like, what were the sources of our value and our identity? In other words, you kind of look at how your life began. What was your family like? How did you grow up? If I had to and I've had lots of these with you already. What was your story like? What did you grow up in? Was it a good home? Was it a bad home? Were your parents indifferent? Were they engaged? Were they abusive or were they loving? What was your experience in school? What was your early employment like? What were you like before you became a disciple of Jesus? I mean, what were some good things that happened in your life? What are some bad things that happened in your life? It's who shaped, it's who created the kind of people that we are today. What about the fall? This is simply looking at and saying, well, how is your life broken? That's it. Right? Even people who don't believe in God and want nothing to do with God will tell you their life is not the way they think it should be. Right? Every single person you talk to, that's why they complain. Because life was not exactly the way they thought it should be. So what happened that was broken? In other words, how were your relationships with others not the way that you wish they could be? How about your relationship with your spouse, with your friends, with your kids? Why are they not? I mean, what types of sins did you end up falling into? What were the addictions? What are the things that you did to cope? You just lived a broken life. And as you think back over your own life, you'll answer these questions like, what did that look like for you? How did that play out in your life? Now, just understand too, by the way, that some of this is all together, right? Just because I became a Christian when I was like 7 years old, that doesn't mean there isn't a creation aspect and a fall aspect to my life. There were still things I've struggled with, and it doesn't matter if it's anger or all kinds of things. They're still there. They're still part of that story because of your family of origin and all that stuff. It's all in there. And what about redemption? How did your life get changed by Jesus? Right? This is what was going on. This is how my life was wrecked. This is the direction it was going. This is the direction it was heading. This is my struggle with people. This is the kind of relationships I used to have. This is why it was a mess. And this is the difference that Jesus made when I got to know him better. I began to trust him. How did that happen? How did I find out about Jesus? For a lot of people, this is later in life. This is the story of why I didn't even know Jesus existed. And then all of a sudden I encountered him and everything changed. Or maybe it's a long period of time. Yeah, I was religious my whole life. I went to school and I was in the Catholic thing and I did. Maybe it's that whole long thing. Or maybe it was you just grew up with it. I don't know. But how did you get to know Jesus? And what is happening and how is God changing you right now? How is he restoring things in your life? What relationships have changed? How are you dealing with your spouse differently? What about your relationships with others? How have you begun to be more humble, more forgiving, more repentant? What does that look like? What's the focus of your life? What is different now than it used to be? Every single one of us has the same story. I was this person because that's kind of how I grew up. That's my past. It wasn't the way it should have been. There was too many broken things in my life. Even, as I got to know Jesus, there was broken things. But here's what he's been doing. Here's how I encountered him. Here's how he began to change me. And I am a different person today, even if it's just in these areas. Not every area, but these areas. He's restoring that. Are you with me? Yes? No? Blank stares? I'll go back over it again if you will. Now, what about their story? So now you're having a conversation with someone, you're having this whole engagement with people who don't necessarily know Jesus. They wouldn't even understand this whole idea because they don't know God's story, and they're just talking, right? I challenge you, as you have these conversations, I want you to listen. Because when you think of creation, every single person you talk to will tell you who and why they became what they are. Right? Once you move to a meaningful conversation, right? You had a casual conversation, meaningful conversation. Somewhere in that meaningful conversation, they're going to start talking about who they credit or blame for who they are or their situation today. You know what? My life was going good. Then I had a crappy boss, and he totally wrecked my life. If it wasn't for that, I would have continued on, and I'm over here. You know what? Life was okay, but then my mom and my dad, they split, and that divorce wrecked us. I'd be a different person if it wasn't for that. Right? You know what? We were going great until that person got elected. Look at how they've wrecked the country, and my life's more miserable because of them. Like, everybody's got something. They look at it and they say, there is a thing that they will blame or credit. Or look, you know what? I just applied myself. I worked hard. Didn't matter. No one gave me anything, but I put my mind to it, and I've become success today. Right? Everybody has a creation story of what they credit or blame for their life. But they also have a fall element to the story because they all blame someone or something for why life is not the way it should be. This can happen in all kinds of ways, right? They have a central belief. Every person has a central belief about the brokenness of the world, right? There is a desire for justice that God has hardwired into every person, but it's twisted, and so people all have a view. Just have this conversation with your neighbor or your friend and ask them, what do you think is wrong with the world? And they'll tell you. You might not agree with them, right? There's a lot of people who are older who blame the entire world's problems on the millennials, right? Well, that's the problem with our world, right? And there's a lot of young people who are like, you know what, if we could just get the old people to move on, that would be the problem, right? There's a lot of people that blame politics on the world, but a lot of times, and then you get more personal, they blame their boss, they blame their parents, they blame their friends. I can't believe they did that. They treated me poorly. This is not good. They have this whole story on what is wrong with the world. Everybody's got one. And here's the cool part. They have a picture of who or what will rescue them from this brokenness. It's fascinating if you have these conversations with people and you pay attention. They have a solution that they think will be the savior that they will trust in to make it work. Many look to a philosophy. Some people, it's just about self-improvement. I'm just going to get better. I'm going to work harder. I'm going to train harder. I'm going to get more schooling. I'm just going to be me, right? Think about how many times you hear that in the news, right? Just be the best person. Be the best version of you. If I can do that, that will be the solution to my problems. If I could just marry the right person, that will be the solution to my loneliness. If I could just find the right job that recognizes me for who I am, my life will be better. If my kids would just listen to me, if they would call me, if this would happen, I mean, just amazing how much better it would be. You know what? If my health, the doctor could just fix this one thing, my life would be better. Everybody's got one. What is it that they want? Redemption. Who or what will rescue them? And then every one of those people has a picture of what the world would look like if their version of how it should be will end up. Right? Do you know that a lot of people who are in the climate movement, that's what they see. If we can just fix this, think of how our world would be. You know what? If we could just solve the problem of racial inequality, just think of what our world could be. You know what? If we just let the free market system do what it had to do, just imagine what it would be. You know what? Just imagine what it would be like. I would end up getting married. I would have enough money. I could raise my kids in peace. I wouldn't have to worry about the public schools. It would be fantastic. Think of how good my life would be. So you have to ask the question, what would the world like if it was the way they think it should be? And who would be the focus of that world? Spiritual conversations happen when we begin to connect these dots. Now, understand, any one of those is a spiritual conversation. You don't have to have the whole conversation. You don't have to address all of that. But any time you connect the dots for people, that's a spiritual conversation. And so we've said this year that we want to go one step further, one step beyond. That's kind of our theme for the year, to try something more, to risk it a little bit more. So one of the ways to do that is to do this in conversations, these spiritual conversations. Listen for their story, right? You're having this casual conversation. It kind of morphs into this deeper conversation, this meaningful conversation. Begin to listen to their story. Where is their life broken? What do they think is the solution to their problem? What do they wish would happen? And then just draw connections for them. And this can be really simple. This doesn't have to be complicated. So let's say you're having a conversation, they're talking about their kids, and they talk about how worried they are. You know, every time I send my kids to school, I'm worried they're going to get shot. You know what? They're not even paying attention to them. They get bullied. I find myself obsessing over this. If the government would just do the right things and spend enough money, I wouldn't have to worry so much about my kids. And you say, oh man, I totally understand that. I used to worry all the time because I was just panicked over what was going to happen to my kids. Right? I was there with you. I don't do that anymore. Why? Well, I just came to realize that God's in control of all this, and I trust Him. And so whenever I feel tempted to worry, I don't anymore. That's a spiritual conversation. How about the guy who gets angry all the time? He's just an angry person. And they talk about it, and they're like, yeah, I get so frustrated. I don't mean to lose my temper, but I do, and I blow up on my kids, and then I'm like, oh, then I feel bad about it. Like, oh man, I get it. I mean, I used to be the most angry person you ever met. Well, you're not that way now. And what's changed? No. I thought about it, wasn't doing anything, and I realized that it was just me trying to control things. And so, God showed me I don't need to do that. He's got it. So that's allowed me to tone my anger down. I'm still working on it, but I'm releasing that to him. Again, spiritual conversation. You see what's happening? They're talking about a bit of their story, right? You know, they're telling you how they wish if this person gets elected, you know, if Trump gets elected, if Biden gets elected, that's going to change everything for the country and everything will be better. Okay, well, now you have a picture of what it is. So your hope is that this is going to happen. Well, I used to think that, but I don't actually think that's the hope of the world anymore. I find a lot more peace in putting it here. Well, why? Because this is what God did in me. You see how that plays together? And that's a spiritual conversation. It's not a salvation conversation. You're not even talking about how to be saved yet. You're just engaging them with who God is, just like Jesus did with the woman at the well. So why does this all matter? Let me take you back to the image of the street preachers that I started with. The ones yelling and getting angry and being forceful on the corner. There was a quote last week in our ESL training that really struck me. It's from a book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus by a guy named Nabil Qureshi. Here's what he said. It's fascinating. There's a simple reason I never listened to street preachers. They didn't seem to care about me. It wasn't that they were annoying. I found their passion admirable. And I appreciated people who stood up for what they believed. Rather, it was that they treated me like an object of their agenda. Did they have any idea how their message would impact my life? Did they even care? On the other hand, if a true friend shares the exact same message, God's story, my story, with heartfelt sincerity, speaking to specific circumstances, specific pieces of my story, and struggles, then the message is heard loud and clear. Effective evangelism requires relationships. There are very few exceptions. The whole point of why we're doing this, and we want to go one step beyond, we want to go a little bit further, we want to see the kingdom come. And God's not trying to make it complicated. He says, look, I'm doing this entire story arc from the time I created to the time I put it all back. That's what's happening. And you, my follower, gets to be a part of this. In fact, I'm doing that same thing in your life. I'm taking what created you and the things that have messed you up, and I'm in the process of redeeming that in your life and restoring it if you'll work with me. And everybody you meet that doesn't know me is in the same boat. All you need to do is connect the dots. Even if they're just 2 dots. That's a spiritual conversation. We are doing communion this morning. It's the heart of the story of God and the intersection of his story with the story of humanity. And so I'm going to have you come up and take the elements and take them back to your seat. But then before we partake, I want to share something. We're going to spend a little bit of time in prayer. Because I want to share the implications of what's been happening in our church in the last couple of weeks that we need to be praying into that matters. And so, as Joey comes up and plays, I'm just going to encourage you when you are ready to come on up, to take them back to your house. But here's what I want you to think about as you're doing it. Don't be chatting with your neighbor. Just what I want you to be doing is thinking and considering this. Think about God's story and your story. And it might be that you're thinking, and it's leading you to thankfulness because you're saying, I can't believe what he did to bring me back to himself. It's amazing. Look what he did. Look at how he reached out and grabbed my life. Look what he did. Look, he took me from there to where I am today. Jesus, thank you. It's only because of your sacrifice that this happened. Or maybe it's a chance for you to say, here's where I'm living in rebellion and sin. Here's where I'm pushing back. I'm being arrogant, God. I'm being prideful. I'm not giving you what I need to. I'm not submitting to you. I know there's broken parts of my life. I don't want it to be that way. I want you to redeem those in my life. I don't know, whichever way God is leading you. Just be thinking of that. Talking to him about it as you come up.